Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're here for part 3, where we're going to turn our attention to form. Form and structure in music is very difficult to assess on a singular listening of a piece. And part of that is because, getting the snapshot of music, it must elaborate and evolve over time, and we can't get the picture of it as a whole in one singular scope like we can for the visual mediums. So how does one create form or structure in a piece of music? We interpret importance when we hear ideas repeated, and repeated ideas, much again like we use them in poetry when we think about rhyme schemes, are well, we give rhyme schemes letters, and we also use them to create structural labels in music. But repetition of ideas or repetition of rhyme schemes helps create form and function and structure in a piece of music or poetry. Let me go ahead and pull up my lecture notes so you can follow along a little easier. When I'm talking about form and structure, I'm dealing with this lower left-hand quadrant of my sheet now. I'm talking about, like I said, the organization of a piece of music. And I often start by asking myself, what is this piece of music trying to do? Or how many ideas does the piece of music have? And I want to start us off with the first one up here. What is the piece of music trying to do? And there are two general divisions of music that we encounter, one of which is absolute music, music that is not meant to tell a story, and then program music, music that is meant to tell a story. And we encounter two kinds of kind of loose forms within the programmatic genre, which are the tone poem, telling a story in a musical format, much like a movie, meaning it's uninterrupted and in one singular section that does not stop, or a program symphony, which is more episodic, like a TV show or a series. That's an instance in which we have ideas that are divided into smaller sections, yet the entire symphony as a whole is trying to elaborate a complete narrative. So I want to start us off with a tone poem. One of them that's probably well known to you at this point is the retelling of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which is by Paul Dukas. Disney realized the programs, visually, to a number of pieces in the Romantic era as a part of Fantasia 1 and Fantasia 2. If you haven't seen either of those, I would recommend it. They're both quite fun. Some of them have absolute music that was not meant to tell a story, that do have programs added to them, but for the most part, they are examples that are within the Romantic era. And the Romantic era was the time, and it was the time certainly, and place being mostly Europe, that where musical storytelling was particularly in vogue. Music was at that point considered one of the highest art forms because of its kind of mystical quality that people adhered to it. So let me go ahead and pull up a small selection of Paul Dukas's The Sorcerer's Apprentice. happening in the story so far, because this is program music, specifically a tone poem. Our sorcerer has left for the evening. He has left his apprentice to do some work. We hear a motif, a musical idea that's going to reoccur, this ba da 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 da, and that's to represent magic. And then we have a foreshadowing of another idea, which is about to play. And that is the idea, the leitmotif or the melody that represents a person, place, character, idea, or situation. And this melody represents the bewitched mop that is going to be doing the bidding of the apprentice. I'd love to go through this piece in full, but the point of program music is that it tells a story, and therefore the music that accompanies it sounds very cinematic in quality. We're going to have lots of movement and motivation when it comes to different textures being involved, different rhythms. While it's not a part of my one sheet, one other thing that I'm going to group into our discussion of harmony in our fourth and final part is timbre. The idea of like, what instruments are we listening to? In this case, we're listening to a very, very dynamic symphony orchestra, which has representations of all of the instrumental families. So it's a very diversely colored ensemble. Moving on to other program music, I want to just play the very beginning of the raucous Rimsky-Korsakov Scheherazade, which is a retelling of Arabian Nights by a Russian composer. Interesting trend of romantic composers to sort of portray exoticism in their works. But I think this is the fourth movement of Scheherazade, is quite fun to listen to, and also very cinematic in quality. Such a cool piece. If you haven't listened to it at all, or this is the first you're hearing of it, I would suggest listening to, honestly, all of these listening examples in full. The Rimsky-Korsakov has very dynamic instrumentation and orchestration, the idea of using the different colors of the orchestra as well. And one thing that doesn't make it on my one sheet, in addition to timbre, is a somewhat obvious dynamic, and that is the relative loudness and softness of sounds, dynamics. And there are going to be musics that focus on having just sort of one dynamic quality to them, and others that want a lot of disparity between quiet and loud sounds, much like we just listened to. Going back to my lecture notes and focusing again on form, and leaving program music for right now, thinking about how many ideas does a piece of music have? Well, if a piece of music has just one idea, we either see that expression sometimes in what we call a circular form, or a sort of ABA form. Even then the B section sort of implies a contrasting idea, or at least feeling. But one singular melody works often accumulate in a form, or culminate in a form rather, that's called a theme and variation. Probably the most famous theme and variation is by Mozart, and it's a variation on Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I just want to play for you the original Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and then the first variation. The idea of a variation is to add complexity to the initial melodic line while making it still recognizable. In a theme and variation, what usually happens is as we move through variations, they become more complicated and less like the original that we listened to. Let me go ahead and pull it up. So that was the initial theme, and then this is the first variation, which is highly ornamented or decorated. The second variation is going to be distinguished because it has something different, markedly different from the first variation. So adding that point of contrast is very essential for us as listeners to understand what's happening with structure or form. You might imagine that if you move on to having two thematic ideas, you wouldn't have that much more complexity in a piece of music. But one of the most complicated forms that exists is a two-themed developmental form, which is always the first movement of a symphony. It's called sonata allegro form. And this diagram in the lower left-hand corner shows you like the bigger elements of what's happening here. We have an introduction followed by an exposition, followed by a development section, a recapitulation, and then a coda. What this really boils down to is this point of stability, then altered by a point of instability, and then a return to stability once more, or something that's otherwise expressed as a circular form, A, B, A. Now, I like to use the first movement of a symphony in direct contrast to a typical jazz standard, which uses these bigger labels in a much more sort of simplified function. And while I can't play you the entirety of Beethoven's Fifth and analyze it in regards to the form, I do want to play the introduction, and the very beginning of the exposition that moves us from the first theme to the bridge to the second theme area. Just to give you an idea of how we can interpret structure and form in a piece that's elapsing in time. So that right there was the introduction. The purpose of the introduction is to set the stage for the exposition. And the exposition is where we're going to pay special attention because it shows us the two themes that are going to be battling against one another in the development section. So that right there was our first theme. It has the iconic ja-ba-ba-ba, that is wound out into a full melody that has an orchestral accompaniment to it. The introduction is otherwise monophonic in texture. It's a way of, again, a short introduction, setting the stage for our first theme. What we're going to hear now is a very brief bridge. That was our bridge. It's a connecting device that's going to lead us to theme 2. How do we know that we're listening to theme 2? Well, it's important that we set a point of contrast from theme 1. Theme 1 has this particular rhythm of fast, 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 slow, yeah? And so we're going to, and it's particularly punctuated. So this second theme is going to be not so brooding and is going to be more lyric in content. So notice that it is much more flowing, it's much prettier. We do have a very sneaky accompaniment that is making reference to our first theme, this ja-da-da-da. But that's a compositional device that Beethoven is often using to create a bigger sense of organic unity in a piece of music. I want to play one more listening example, but before doing so, want to go back to my lecture notes. And here we are. The jazz standard. We're going to listen to this piece in its entirety, but what happens here is that we have an expression of an ABA form using one main central melody. Again, it's a singular themed work, but our contrasting B section is going to be identified by not having our singer involved. So we have a very short introduction, which is just instrumental, our A section where we have our lead singer, our B section where we do just something instrumental, and then a return to our A section at the end, which ends with a coda of a finishing point or a final cadence in a piece of music. Let me go ahead and pull up our listening example, The Girl from Ipanema.
Young and lovely, the girl from Ipanema goes walking, and when she passes, each one she passes goes. When she walks, she's like a samba that swings so cool and sways so gently that when she passes, each one she passes goes. He smiles, but she doesn't see.
that ends the A section. Now we're going to go into the B section. B section is ended. We're going to go back to the A section.
Oh, but he watches so sadly. How can he tell her he loves her? Yes, he would give his heart gladly. But each day when she walks to the sea, she looks straight ahead, not at him. Tall and tan and young and lovely, the girl from Ipanema goes walking. And when she passes, he smiles, but she doesn't see.
Okay, now from this point on, we have what's called a coda. It's an elaborated, sort of elongated ending that helps the listener sort of flags their attention to knowing that the song is going to end.
She just doesn't see, no, she doesn't see, she just doesn't see.
Notice that in the cadence, the final coda, or the final cadence, which is the coda, ends up a lot sort of repeating one idea from the lyric in order to again flag to the listener that we are ending the song. So that's by no means an exhaustive list of all of the forms, but just a kind of starting point to get us thinking about how ideas repeating help create structure in a piece of music. And again, the difference of ideas is actually relatively difficult to tell in a piece of music. So often we're not encountering pieces of music that have more than 3 musical ideas because, again, we're asking the listener to keep track of a lot of information that way. Perhaps the exception is in program music, where we're adhering leitmotifs, melodies, to people, places, characters, ideas, or situations. And oftentimes we have a better time of remembering them through the marriage of that programmatic music with a visual element. I'm thinking about film scores specifically, for example, Lord of the Rings, where we have many differing leitmotifs that you encounter within the entirety of the film, and there's certainly more than 3. When we return for our 4th segment, we're going to talk about harmony and a little bit more about timbre and instrumentation. But I will see you in part 4 shortly.